What's up, guys? Welcome to Breaking the Set. I'm Abby Martin. Well, over the weekend, America's grossly over-militarized police force once again showed its true colors. First in Charlotte, North Carolina, where police killed 24-year-old football player Jonathan Farrell, who was seeking help after miraculously surviving a car crash. A homeowner called 911 and told dispatchers that a man was repeatedly knocking on her door. According to police, when they arrived at the scene, Farrell charged at them. But something tells me that by charge, they meant stumbling, injured. So naturally, one of the cops fired his stun gun. When that failed to stop him, another police officer opened fire and killed him. But not to be outdone in the police brutality department, on the same day in New York City, the NYPD opened fire in Times Square toward a man pretending to point a gun at officers. Instead of hitting the crazed man, who was later found to be unarmed, police struck two female bystanders. Protect and serve? More like shoot first, ask questions later. With all the constant reminders about 9/11, there's one crucial element consistently left out of the conversation: the sick and dying first responders who risked their lives on that fateful day. Emergency responders right now have a 15% higher rate of contracting cancer than the general population. And already more than 1,000 people who rushed to Ground Zero to help have tragically died, according to the CDC. Sadly, the 9/11 heroes you would expect the government to be helping the most have been left in the dust. To talk more about the struggle for medical care, I'm joined now by John Feel, first responder, founder and president of the Feel Good Foundation. John, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me, Abby.
Talk about the most pressing medical issues facing 9/11 first responders right now.
Cancer. In the beginning, in the first few years, it was respiratory, but now it's cancers. And this is just the first wave of cancers: the blood cancers, the leukemias, the organ cancers. But in 5 or 10 more years, you're going to see the asbestos cancers. There'll be another wave of cancers. And like I tell everybody, this is a generation-long issue and a generation-long illness.
What's the status of the Zadroga Act right now, and how many victims has it compensated thus far?
Well, I can tell you a really important date is October 3rd of this year, which is about, I believe, 17 days from now. If you were affected by 9/11, if you were there, even if you're sick or not sick, you should register with the VCF to get compensated, because after October 3rd, you'll be left out. And this is a bill that we passed 3 years ago, and the healthcare has been up and running for 2 years now and doing a great job. And the compensation part of the bill is slowly catching up to the healthcare part. But keep in mind, this is only a 5-year bill, which it expires in October of 2016. And we're going to have to go back to the Congress and walk the halls of Congress again and get this bill renewed. So there's a lot of obstacles and a lot more hurdles in our way.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, there's been multiple waves, and there's to be more to come as well. Waves of cancer. As I understand, there's been quite a difficulty even getting Congress to cover all of the cancer cases thus far. What's been the delay on that?
Well, you know, let me take everybody back in time. You know, for years they said we weren't sick and we were crying wolf. The fact of the matter is the wolf ate us, and the wolf being cancer. And right now, NIOSH, what administrates the healthcare part of the bill, this is a 2-part bill, the James Zadroga Health and Compensation Act. There's over 1,500 people that have been certified now by NIOSH, and there's still thousands of others with 9/11 related cancer. You know, for years, they told us this was a New York issue. There's 435 congressional districts in the United States. 430 of them were represented at Ground Zero. Somebody from every state came to New York during the cleanup and the recovery and went home, and a lot of people got sick. And the National 9/11 program now treats over 12,000 people from across the country that are sick from their heroic actions at Ground Zero the days and weeks after.
And you mentioned how it expires. What happens when it does expire? And is the $4 billion allotted thus far enough to cover everyone's expenses? And how is the money allocated? I just threw a lot of questions at you.
Well, no, it's a good question. $4.3 billion. $1.5 billion of that is for the health care, and there's plenty of money there to treat everybody for 5 years. When we go to renew the bill, the health care part of this bill will be renewed. I will bet my one kidney on that. I'm that confident that even Congress, as poorly job they're doing now, will not renew this bill. The compensation part is $2.7 billion and change. They're waiting till October 3rd and see how many people they have on October 4th that have registered and filed claims, and then they'll be able to make a determination on how people are going to start to be compensated. Right now, there's about 27,000 people that have registered, and I'm going to say a third of that have legitimate claims because they're ill from 9/11 and its aftermath. You know, if you took every toxin that was in the air that day and the following days, you put it in a bottle, you'd have a skull and crossbones saying harmful if swallowed, consult a physician. Then you have the toxic soup combined, and that was something that no doctor, no scientist has ever seen before. And the absorption through the nose, mouth, and skin has made these men and women, and, you know, I say these men and women, I'm one of them, has made these people sick. And, you know, for years they said we had to prove that 9/11 got us sick. We don't have to prove it anymore. They have to prove that 9/11 didn't get us sick.
Good point. And sadly, so many people have already lost their lives, John. We can't wait any longer. Speaking of the toxic slew, 7 days after 9/11, Christine Todd Whitman, of course, the former head of the EPA, issued this statement that she's glad to reassure the people of New York the air is safe to breathe, the water is safe to drink. The concentrations are such that they don't pose a health hazard. We're going to make sure everyone's safe. John, do you think that her and other government employees should be held criminally culpable for falsely assuring people that they were safe?
Well, listen, Christy Todd Whitman, she's going to meet God one day, and God will be her judge. She can live with her action and her words. I remember that, you know, on September 17th, which is tomorrow's my anniversary when I was horribly injured, I remember Christy Todd Whitman coming out on the 16th and saying the air was safe to breathe, the water was safe to drink. She took her orders from the White House. And listen, they wanted Wall Street up and running, and they had to do what they had to do. Do I understand it? Yes. Do I agree with it? No. Thousands of good, innocent people got sick, and many have passed away. We lost about close to 1,400 people since 9/11 from their illnesses. And this year alone, we lost 42 that we know of, that we're keeping track of. 42 people taken from us too soon, and close to 1,400. You know, on 9/11, 2,751 innocent lives were lost to senseless violence. We're halfway to them now because of poor leadership and bad politics and basically corruption. And, you know, I've said this a million times. A circus monkey could have been more compassionate and done a better job politicking after 9/11. Between Congress, Albany, and City Hall, a lot of people dropped the ball on helping people. And, you know, when you have a position of power and leadership, you have a moral responsibility to help your constituents. And, you know, a lot of people, they have to look themselves in the mirror and say, you know what, I think I failed.
Absolutely. John Feel Good Foundation. Everyone check it out. We got to put the pressure on Congress, fund the 9/11 first responders. Thank you so much for everything you do.
God bless you.
Think back to 12 years ago, to how you felt right after the attacks of September 11, 2001. There was a national climate of fear, sadness, despair, and anger. From Paris to Tehran, U.S. allies and enemies held candlelight vigils in solidarity. World leaders presented a unique opportunity for understanding, reconciliation, and peace. Yet amidst the chaotic aftermath of the attacks, too many were already calling for blood. And just 72 hours later, lawmakers were already voting on a resolution that would take this country to war. But it wasn't just any war declaration. It was an unprecedented measure that would come to redefine the role of America's intelligence and armed forces in the 21st century. The 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, or the AUMF, is a broadly worded piece of legislation that gives any president authority under the law to preemptively attack any country, organization, or individual deemed either a threat to the U.S. or an associated force to terrorism. It was a codifying step toward perpetual war, which sadly still continues today. Yet in the deliberating moments to award such unprecedented power, there was a lone voice that warned us of what these actions could lead to. On September 14, 2001, Barbara Lee, a congresswoman from Berkeley, California, stood alone on the floor to cast the only no vote against the AUMF, while 420 other representatives voted to give the president a blank check.
September 11th changed the world. Our deepest fears now haunt us. Yet I am convinced that military action will not prevent further acts of international terrorism against the United States. This is a very complex and complicated matter.
A complicated matter indeed. Not only would America be waging a war against an invisible enemy, but in the name of national security, lawmakers recklessly abandon their responsibility to uphold the values of the Constitution.
However difficult this vote may be, some of us must urge the use of restraint. Our country is in a state of mourning. Some of us must say, let's step back for a moment. Let's just pause just for a minute and think through the implications of our actions today so that this does not spiral out of control.
Yes, we should have taken that moment to consider the logic of fighting a tactic in every corner of the world. See, Barbara Lee understood the consequences that go along with military action. She understood that hate begets hate, and violence begets violence.
As a member of the clergy so eloquently said, as we act, let us not become the evil that we deplore.
Millions dead as a result of the brutal U.S. occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. Thousands lost in a series of shadow wars worldwide. The rise of drone bombings, extrajudicial assassinations, indefinite detention, and the unchecked growth of an entire industry devoted to bloodshed. Unfortunately, Barbara Lee's warning has become reality. In the process of fighting a global war on terror, the U.S. has become the greatest purveyor of terror in the world. It's rare to find a government insider that not only recognizes America's system of two-tiered justice, but is actively working to expose it. Ramsey Clark served as Attorney General, overseeing the Department of Justice under President Lyndon B. Johnson from 1965 to 1967. During his term, Clark was instrumental in passing two of the most significant bills of our time, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. Since leaving the administration, Ramsey has been one of the most prominent figures leading the charge against U.S. militarism. He's traveled everywhere from Vietnam to Iraq, where he studied the devastating effects of Western sanctions on local populations. He documented his findings in a 2002 book called Impact of Sanctions on Iraq, The Children Are Dying. Clark joined me earlier to discuss his research on Iraqi sanctions, the evolution of the rule of law since his time as Attorney General, and why he represented Saddam Hussein. I first asked him what Iraq was like before Western intervention in 1991.
Iraq was the most prosperous Arab country in the world. The standard of living was highest. Infrastructure was better than most parts of the United States. They had good education, good health care. That's before 1991, before the Gulf War, the invasion in the period after 1991, January 1991, when we invaded and started bombing them. We had over 100,000 sorties on every few minutes to bomb the daylights out of the whole country in 1991. But before that, it was very prosperous and progressive, and since then it's suffered enormously. Nobody feels safe any day in Iraq, haven't since 2003 at least, if not 1991, and hundreds killed every week, thousands more often than not. The country's been crushed in a unique way for a uniquely long period of time, with violence enduring.
And in the 90s, talk about how many children died as a direct result of these sanctions, and why specifically children?
Well, I'm a big supporter of the UN. It's the hope of, one of the major hopes at least, of peace on earth. But the UN sanctions that were imposed on Iraq in August of '90 impacted severely on its imports. And they couldn't get infant formula, for instance. And by the late fall of that year, 47,500 children under the age of 5 had died as a direct result of the sanctions. Within 3 or 4 years, 475,000 could be counted who had died as a direct result of the sanctions. I was going into Iraq every year during that period, and I'd always go through maternity wards, and you were lucky if you spent 30 minutes in there to get out without an infant dying. They'd be on the bed with their mother. That's their custom there. And the mother would just start wailing when the baby died. We tried to take infant formula in, but it takes a lot of infant formula to feed the infants of a country the size of Iraq or larger. And they couldn't get it for all their wealth because of the sanctions and because of the military threat and the military action against them constantly. One of the great crimes against humanity since World War II.
Have sanctions ever worked without having devastating effects on the people of certain countries instead of the regime?
Well, if you think about it for a few minutes, sanctions impact the weakest, the poorest, those with less power, less access to the necessities of life and the pleasures of life. And infants, somebody's got to help them. They can't make it by themselves. And if their parents are poor and you can't import infant formula, and the mothers are malnourished and mother's milk is well below normal production, if available at all in a particular mother, and the infants die. There's that famous incident which our Secretary of State was asked on one of our major interview programs. 575,000 children under the age of 5 dead as a direct result of the sanctions. Is the price worth it? And she notoriously looked at the camera and said, difficult question, but yes, the price is worth it. But listen, there's no morality in anyone who can say that anything is worth the lives of 575,000 children.
Ramsey, you were talking about the bombing campaign that was going on at the same time as these harsh economic sanctions were being applied to Iraq. What were the targets of those bombs at that time?
And they were hitting infrastructure primarily from one end to the other, from the border with Turkey to Basra and below. And they were hitting bridges. In Baghdad, they hit so many places. I remember the Justice Ministry, which is a place I frequented, got badly hit. But it was intended to, it also hit agriculture, even trying to burn fields and destroy date crops and things like anything that would nourish the people. So it had genocidal purposes and was strategically determined.
Right, so not just military targets. I mean, obviously this is a lot of civilian infrastructure targeted on purpose, as you just mentioned. Given what you've seen and how sanctions adversely affect the population of these countries the most, how do you feel about this administration using humanitarianism as the justification for a strike on Syria?
Well, it's pretty inhumanitarian, to put it mildly. It's also a terrible violation of human rights and international law. One country can't take it upon itself to be a policeman for the whole world. Think it can bomb people wherever they are at any whim or for any stated or unstated purpose. Their purposes are usually unstated. They may state something that they claim is their purpose, but it rarely is their real purpose. Their real purpose is to change the government of Syria. They're driving and endangering the entire Christian population there, which is a very large population, for the largest of any of the Middle East countries. We need integration, religious and otherwise, if we're going to live in peace with each other. And particularly at this time, I've been very close to Muslim people. I love Muslim people, and I recognize their goodness and their strength and their courage. But we have to live at peace with them.
I couldn't agree more with that one, Ramsey. You've taken a lot of heat for choosing to be part of Saddam Hussein's legal representation. Why did you choose to represent a brutal dictator?
Well, I didn't seek it. I was sought, and I felt an absolute duty to do it if I was requested. Rights should belong to everyone. If we don't have equal rights, we don't have rights. We have privileges and underprivileges, you know. And I believe in rights. I've lived my adult life struggling for people's rights as a lawyer and otherwise. And he got no fair trial. A fair trial wasn't possible, perhaps under the circumstances, but certainly not turning him over to people who've been trying to assassinate him for the last 20 years. And finally did after a trial. It was a farce. But asked to stand there with him and try to intercede in the interest of truth and justice, I would have had a hard time living with myself if I hadn't agreed to do it. I'd do it again in a minute. I could not do it.
Well put. Considering how this week marked the 12th anniversary of the horrific 9/11 terrorist attacks, what's your take on how the government decided to kill and throw bin Laden's body in the ocean instead of giving a trial, evidence, or any answers to the American people?
Well, to put it very mildly, we don't practice what we preach. And to put it more directly, we totally ignore fundamental human rights, international law, and our own moral standards when it comes to international affairs. Our government, I mean, you know, I just came back this year from the 60th anniversary of the war in Korea and the 40th anniversary of the war in Vietnam. Millions killed. The only good thing is the people are thriving. It's beautiful to see. It shows that there is a future after hell.
The war on terror is now carried out by the executive being judge, jury, and executioner, especially in these drone wars, just killing people that they claim are terrorists without any fair trial at all. How dangerous of a precedent are we setting for the rest of the world with this policy?
Well, we're saying that the powerful do as they will and the weak suffer as they must. And that's the cruelest and most immoral thing that you can say to society. The powerful should try to uplift the poor, you know. They'd feel a lot better about themselves if they did. They'll talk about their aid, but it's so darn political, you realize it's just to strengthen themselves. And the violence that, whereas Dr. Martin Luther King said, and it really hurt him to say it, the greatest purveyor of violence on earth is my own country. 1967 at the Riverside Church here in New York. The greatest purveyor of violence is the United States of America.
Someone like you who has served in the administration decades ago, seeing it out on the outside now, when you were serving in government, was it more transparent and accountable to itself and the people than it is today? Or is the level of deceit and corruption kind of all relative?
As Attorney General, I can tell you I felt a free hand. I wouldn't have stayed if I hadn't, to render justice as I saw fit. It's possible to make a difference, but it's a struggle, and it's not sure that any difference you make will long endure.
And what would you tell people now who just feel like it's hopeless and you know, looking at the world and say, how can we get out of this policy of bellicose militarism?
The harder it gets, the more important it is that we stand up and struggle. I watched in the 60s the pain and misery and danger to our African-American population. I spent a lot of time in the early 60s. I was working primarily in the early 60s. I was young, I was from the South, I had a Southern accent, I could pass. And the African-Americans were facing danger and humiliation and deprivation all the time. And they sang and they marched and they said, "We shall overcome." And we ain't got there yet, but we've gotten a lot better off than we were, and we're still struggling and still marching and still believing that we shall overcome. If you don't believe that, you might as well crawl in a hole and bury yourself. The struggle is the whole purpose of life.
It is indeed, Ramsey, and we definitely have seen change happen, albeit slowly. It does happen, and it takes the struggle in the streets. Thank you so much for being a voice of the people, representing justice and truth. Ramsey Clark, former U.S. Attorney General. That's it for me tonight. All of us here at Breaking the Set, we'll see you right back here tomorrow.